Hello, and this is Society for Dummies.
Yes, that's right. Your weekly dose of society.
I'm Alan.
And this is Luca, yes. And we're in the studio with two very, very special people this week. Their names are John Pilbrow he is an Emeritus, am I pronouncing that right?
Emeritus.
Emeritus Professor of Physics in Monash University. He's the co-editor of Christian Perspective on Science Technology, CPOSAT, and Deputy Chair of the Melbourne Anglican Committee on Christianity and Atheism.
And here we have Matthew, and you're from the Australian Foundation of Atheist Foundation of Australia.
That's the one, that's correct.
Yeah.
So
we're going to try and have this whole thing as kind of a discussion on atheism and on Christianity and their respective roles in society.
Yeah, I think it's probably something that definitely needs to be talked about in a show that's focusing on ideology. So yes, this should be a very good show. I hope you guys are looking forward to it.
And if you guys ever want to text in, you can text in on 0427 SMS. That's 0427 767 767.
Yes, indeed.
This is Trains by Porcupine Tree. That was Trains by Porcupine Tree.
That is indeed correct.
And now we're going to be starting off our discussion on atheism and its role in society. And so, Matthew, what is the role of atheism in the modern world?
Well, I don't know that it actually has a role. It's not an organisation with a doctrine, with a mission. It's just, my atheism is a result of me not believing in deities. So nothing else flows from that. There is nothing that needs to come from that. So I joined an atheist organisation. I joined the Atheist Foundation of Australia because I thought that it was good to have a bit of a sense of community with other atheists. At the time that I joined, I felt quite ostracised, quite lonely, that atheism or atheists were not frowned upon so much in Australia, but you didn't feel welcome bringing up the fact that you didn't believe in deities or you didn't have a religion. So I joined an organisation that had a newsletter and a forum online and got a bit of a sense of community from that. Since then, they've had two large conventions that really brought that sense of community to the fore and brought some pretty impressive speakers out to Australia to give their ideas. And I didn't agree with all of them, but it was still a tremendous event, and I got a lot from being part of that. So I don't think there is a mission statement for atheism. I don't think anything needs to stem from atheism, but I am an atheist because I don't believe in a deity. If my goals as an atheist, which personally are mostly being left alone and not having my taxes siphoned sideways or my children indoctrinated in their school, if those goals are met in my lifetime, the word atheist would probably become meaningless for me. It would still describe me accurately, but I wouldn't need to describe myself as an atheist.
Yeah, so you're the rule rather than the exception, I suppose.
Well,
when you are the rule.
When you are the rule.
I wouldn't claim to be speaking on the behalf of other atheists. I'd be extremely annoyed if someone else claimed to be doing that for me. I'm just giving you my perspective on it.
Okay, that makes sense.
Several atheist organisations will say our goal is to keep religion out of politics or something along the lines of that. What do you think of that sort of thing?
I think it's axiomatic that religion should be kept separate to politics from both directions. I think it is unfair for a religion to involve itself in the decisions that are going to affect everyone in a society. And I think there is also another direction to that street in that becoming involved in politics allows politics to affect religion. And the best example I can think of that is in 1876, the Privy Council in England declared that hell wasn't necessary doctrine to the Anglican Church. It was an act of the Privy Council, which, because the Church of England is the established Church of England, it is affected by legal decisions by the Privy Council. And then in Parliament, in the early 20th century, there was a decision in Parliament that declined changes to the Book of Common Prayer. So a lot of people within the Church of England wanted to disestablish because they didn't want Parliament affecting their religion. So I think in both directions there are reasons not to have an established church.
Okay, that makes sense, I suppose. And I suppose this next question goes to John Pilbrow. I'd like to ask you, often this is, Christians will often say that atheism is merely a fad and it's just going to go away after a while. Would you agree with them?
No, I wouldn't agree with them. in the last couple of years, I've read twice through a major book by the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor called A Secular Age, in which over some 700 pages he traces the history of the ideas that are commonly found in modern atheism, right back to the Greek philosophers and right through the medieval periods and the Enlightenment and so on. So I think that the ideas that are around and perpetrated by atheists of various sorts will go on being around for some time to come. I'd like to just come back to something that Matthew was saying before, or really to raise something he didn't say. He said that he wanted to be sort of left alone, but the reality is we all live in a society. If the society were to be run essentially on atheist principles, there would have to be some agreement about ethical and other standards. And I just wonder what your response to that is.
Well, I would say that there are no atheist principles. I don't think there is anything that stems from atheism, as I said before. You can run a society on Kantian principles, you can run it on all sorts of other philosophical models without needing religion to be part of that. You can look at, I value my life, and because I value my life, I don't think anyone else should be able to take it from me. If I want that right respected, I have to respect the rights of other people, that I don't take their lives. That's that sort of Kantian universality principle. So you can come to do not kill almost from first principles. Religion doesn't have to enter into that, so you don't need to be citing religious precedent, and it's not an actual atheist principle that I'm citing in my desire not to be killed and my principle that I will not kill others without good reason.
Well, the question of whether there are these universal principles does have some bearing on the question of where they come from, because they are found in most societies that have existed in the last 4,000 or 5,000 years. I can't comment on the periods before that. And they don't seem to come from nowhere. I think for Christians, aspects of them are codified for us in things like the Ten Commandments and the amplification of that we find in the teaching of Jesus in the New Testament. But the presence of ideas and limits on behaviour are not simply a function of Christianity or some other religious position. They are things which have some universal level of agreement, perhaps not in great detail, but certainly in general principle.
Well, I would say that of the Ten Commandments, only two have any ethical component, and they are do not kill, do not steal. And I think that they are part of most cultures because humans have evolved to live best when they live as a community, and not killing and not stealing are the best strategy for living as a community. So I think it's actually an evolved feature of humanity, not a cultural idea that has come from religion.
Now, I'm sorry to cut you off, guys, but we're going to go to a song and then a promotion. So this is Spoonful by Daniel Champagne. He's a fantastic young artist. He played at Port Fairy last year, which is where I get most of my music. Solo, acoustic guitar, singing, that kind of thing.
Very interesting discussion, though. This is like...
Yes. If you guys want to text in on 0427 SMS 0427 767 767, please feel free to do so. Yes, so please pay for your sins. It'd be fantastic. We're sharing a mic at the moment.
Yes. So, be nice to have another mic.
Yes. The song you heard was Spoonful by Daniel Champagne. Definitely check him out. Needs all the help he can get. Young independent artists, that kind of thing.
Yay! Those things are good. Record companies don't need all the money. Now, we're in the studio with Matthew from the Atheist Foundation of Australia and John Pilbrow, you're representing the Anglican Church, is that right?
Well, I was asked through the bishop that you contacted, although I think I'm here as an individual Christian, in fact.
Yeah. Very good. And John was going to respond to Matthew's proposal that ethics is, in fact, something which humans evolved for material reasons, as opposed to something which may have come from Christianity. Oh, sorry. John was going to respond to Matthew's proposal that ethics is something which evolved for material reasons, as opposed to, say, something which came from religion or spirituality in any way. So, have you got a response to that, John?
Partial response. Given an evolutionary understanding of how we happen to be here today, the emergence of consciousness and self-reflection, of course, is an important part of our consideration here. But at the same time, I do believe that many of the ethical principles that we regard as very important were not just simply a result of our evolutionary development, but have a sense that that there was a revelation from God. I'm a Christian, I believe in God, at some point. Now, it's true that there were other cultures, like in the Middle East, where there were codes of behaviour which were not that dissimilar from what we now know as the Ten Commandments. But I don't accept that they simply arose in the sociological context of early human society without an additional input.
So, John, if pardon me, if ethics arose in humanity from that revelation, surely you will have encountered the Euthyphro dilemma. I'll just run through it quickly for the listeners. If our ethics come from a deity, does the nature of the deity determine what is good and bad? Or does the deity have to obey a universal code of what is good and bad? Because each horn of that dilemma has its own repercussions. If the deity decides what is good and bad, then ethics are largely arbitrary. We could be doing bad things, but because the deity has decreed them good, then, to us it's irrelevant. Being obedient to that deity has nothing to do with being good or bad. It's just obedience. If the deity has decreed what is good and bad from some larger sense of good and bad that permeates the universe, then the deity is something other than omnipotent. It can't do anything. It can't determine what is good and bad.
That's interesting. That's a very interesting point. How would you respond to that, John?
It's a difficult question to respond to, but I'll do my best. There is a sense in which one can argue, and people have argued this, that the emergence of our ethical principles, in a sense, are embedded in the very fabric of the universe. That's been argued by the South African cosmologist, social activist George Ellis, and an American Christian philosopher, Nancy Murphy, in their book on the moral nature of the universe. But they're not arguing in that it's only that they're allowing or accepting the fact that there will be interaction between God, which Matthew refers to as the deity, and individual people. I'd like to bring the discussion into the realm of the New Testament, where Jesus taught. He went deeper than the rules, if you like, of the Ten Commandments by probing deeper into their meaning. For example, hatred he regarded as serious as murder, and that's not necessarily implied in the Ten Commandments as we have them in front of us. Also, he, I believe, argued for an ethical principle, which wasn't just a matter of obeying a set of rules, but was a response to a good God who had provided an environment for us in which to live fruitfully. I think I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Yeah, we might leave the ethical discussion for now. It's really interesting. But one of our listeners has texted in asking, how can someone in the modern age defend divine intervention? Could you respond to that?
Yes, I'm very happy to do so. First of all, I don't like the term divine intervention if it implies that God interferes with the laws of nature which he's established. The principle of non-interventionist objective divine action, if I can use that complicated terminology.
What does it mean, sorry?
Well, it means that God acts through the structure of the material world. Let me just explain. There was a series of conferences held through the 90s. There were 6 of them, to which about 25 people were invited to each, physicists, philosophers, theologians, and so on. And they were asking the question, were there scientific perspectives that could be brought to bear on divine action? And the 2 issues that came out of that were, does quantum physics for example, the so-called Heisenberg uncertainty principle, provide one of the windows through which God would be able to interact with the material world and us in particular, without violating the underlying principles which govern the behaviour of the universe.
I think I see what you're talking about. So God acts through the universe as opposed to sticking his hand down and fiddling with it.
Yes.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the other one that's been considered, not without some level of discussion and controversy, is the role that chaos theory might provide. For example, there's the so-called butterfly effect. What's understood came out of long-range weather forecasting. A very tiny change in the initial condition, maybe the temperature or the wind velocity or somewhere in Africa, might have the effect eventually of an El Nino somewhere in the Pacific. And that's as another case that's been argued on the basis that it leaves open what's called an ontological gap, but again one in which God would not be violating any principles. And I don't mean simply that we're talking about the laws of physics like Newton's laws of motion and so on, but deeper underlying laws which we may not know a whole lot about anyway.
That makes sense. No. So I suppose it wouldn't actually be that hard for God to affect the universe without having to do some massive act of some kind. So hopefully that answered your question, Mr. Texty Man. And by the way, this guy is like a professor in physics. He seems to know his stuff here. Alan, question.
We have another question texted in. If God works via the natural order, then why are human morals and an understanding conceived through evolutionary behaviour?
I don't even understand that question myself, to be honest.
There's a lot of complicated words there.
Yeah,
So if God works via the natural order, so through the universe, I suppose, rather than poking his finger in, as Lucas so eloquently put it, then why are human morals not an understanding conceived through evolutionary behaviour?
Well, I think I can interpret that question. If the texter disagrees, they might write back in. But where John has proposed a mechanism by which God could influence the world, there is no evidence that that's actually occurring, and the most parsimonious explanation for our existence here, and in my mind for our ethics, is evolutionary, which doesn't require the action of the deity. So if God is interacting through that quantum mechanism, how would we recognise that as being different from naturally evolved systems?
Well, can I say, first of all, that we're talking about the evolutionary process. I think there's one school of thought, and I think Richard Dawkins would adopt this, that evolution is totally directionless. Simon Conway Morris, who's a fellow of the Royal Society and a professor at Cambridge in paleontology, has, through his work on the famous Burgess fossils in Canada, concluded that evolution has certain inbuilt limitations. In other words, not every conceivable outcome will either occur, or if it did, will work and survive. And he finds that there are what he calls regions of evolutionary outcome that lead to fruitful development, fruitful organisms, whether in the plant or the animal kingdoms. And so when we talk about the role that evolution plays, we have to think about the actual process itself. Now, Robert John Russell, who heads the Centre for Theology and Natural Science at Berkeley in California, has strongly argued that the uncertainty principle could indeed work at the level of the causing of mutations in DNA, resulting from, for example, cosmic rays that are passing through us at I don't know, some number per second anyway. And there are other influences, that chemical and other influences that can affect our DNA. So it's not just a matter of claiming that evolution, the evolutionary understanding, provides a complete worldview. I believe it doesn't. I believe philosophically that's an untenable position anyway, whether you're a Christian or an atheist.
Yeah. Okay. Would you like to respond to that at all, Matthew? Or?
I'd like to ask what would constitute a testable hypothesis for that interaction that you're claiming must have occurred for evolution to have gotten the diversity that we have now. I think we are what we are. Perhaps I'll couch this in terms of genetic heritage. So hundreds, thousands of breeding events occurred to bring each of us here. So the likelihood of any one of us existing is very, very small, because there's tens of millions of sperm in each event and tens of thousands of eggs available to make those genetic combinations. So you only have to go back a few generations and suddenly the numbers are staggeringly huge against your particular genetic combination existing. But what was sure to happen was that someone would exist. It might not have been you, but someone would have come because those breeding events were successful. So evolution is directionless. It didn't necessarily need to end in us, but if evolutionary processes are going on, it will end up with something. Something will occur. Whether or not they can discuss it in a radio studio is another matter. But I don't think you can just point at evolution and say, it's not enough to explain this. I think it is enough to explain this, and any other explanation that requires you to start adding extra bits, you're losing the parsimony, and yeah, you're just begging the question.
Okay, I mean, I suppose that makes sense.
Yeah, so we've got two very defined positions there, I suppose. And now we're going to listen to some Birds of Tokyo, who are very good.
We might come back to the discussion after the break.
Yes, we'll also be discussing arguments against God. That was Waiting for the Wolves by Birds of Tokyo, and we're talking with John Pilbrow from Monash University, Professor of Physics, and Matthew from the Atheist Foundation of Australia. And we're going to move on to a discussion about the existence of God. And I was wondering, Matthew, what you think is the strongest argument against God's existence?
I don't think there's a catch-all for that. I grew up in the Anglican tradition and was taught in church about an almighty being, omnipotent, omniscient, and able to do or think anything. And the argument that I came up against that was the Omnimax paradox. You can't be all-knowing and all-capable, because if you know everything, you're unable to act. You cannot act outside the way that you know you will act. So those two things are contradictory.
Sorry, can you run that past us again?
The Omnimax paradox. You can't be all-knowing and all-capable. You can't be omnipotent and omniscient, because if you know everything, you cannot act outside the way that you know that you will act. You know all possible futures, you know everything that's going to happen, so you can't break that train.
Well, actually, I think I have heard an answer to that. So you're saying that because you know everything, you know exactly what you're going to do, and therefore
you can't act.
Yeah, okay. But it's possible, potentially, I'm just thinking, that perhaps God ignores time, potentially, and he exists outside time altogether.
I get that thrown at me a lot by people talking about the cosmological arguments for God. And I don't know what it means to say acting outside of time.
It's potential that perhaps he exists in everything is happening to him at once, potentially. Perhaps he, for example, perhaps he's experiencing, I don't know, this particular radio show at the same time when the first cavemen banged rocks together. As in, he hasn't experienced time in like a linear fashion, potentially.
That doesn't break the Omnimax. I'm sorry. That doesn't make the Omnimax. That doesn't break the Omnimax paradox for my money, though, because the being can't act outside of those constraints that it already knows exist for all time. So, a being that exists outside of time can't begin to act. It can't. It couldn't even gather its thoughts, because we're trying to talk about things that we can't really comprehend. We are temporal beings. We live in 3 dimensions and experience time linearly. So when you're trying to think about creation and take time out of the equation, it starts to sound a bit nonsensical to me. So, but that wasn't what I was thinking about in church when I was a kid. I was going to Sunday school and I was coming up with questions like, who made God? God made all of this. Who made God? And that gives you that infinite regress. Who made the being that made God, and who made the being that made God that made God? And so that was a question that I had as a child that started me thinking. And the other one that really worried me as a child was the story of Abraham and Isaac. For listeners unfamiliar with it, Abraham is told by God to sacrifice his son, and he makes ready to do so, and his son is there on the altar ready to be killed. And that was taught to me as a child as a laudable lesson in obedience to God. And all it did was scare the pants off me. I really hope my dad doesn't kill me.
Yeah, right.
And that sort of the deity communicating an idea to a person and the person acting on it, it really didn't sit well with me. And it still doesn't. There are people out there that have made threats against me because they think God wants them to act a particular way. And that's terrifying.
Yeah, that makes sense. How would you respond to that, John?
Well, the first thing I'd want to say is that we have free will, and John Polkinghorne, the famous Cambridge mathematical physicist who resigned his professorship to go off and study theology, and he's written a lot of books in the last 30-odd years, he also argues for what he calls the free process defence. That is, that he understands that the universe has evolved with a certain degree of its own freedom. It's that God doesn't take action that violates the freedom he's already given to the universe, and in the same way, God doesn't violate the free will that we have as well. Back to what Matthew was arguing in relation to the paradox, and that if God's all-knowing and all-powerful, that there's a paradox there. The question is, I believe God knows all that is to be known, but if you ask, does God know what I'm going to say next or do next? I think the answer to that is no. Otherwise, that would be a violation of the free will, which I believe is part of being human.
I'm not completely sold that we do have free will. I'm still thinking and reading about it a lot, but we are constrained very strongly by physics. I don't have free will to levitate to the ceiling, and I can't stop breathing. I'm not entirely sure that other actions and things that we think of as choices aren't determined by chemistry and physics. I like to think that we do have choices, but I think that they are couched in the context of everything that we've experienced up to that point, and the physical and material constraints that we exist within. But I don't know that religion offers scope for free will in itself, because you're faced with the choice of worship or be damned, and that isn't a free system. That doesn't leave you options.
There are two things I'll try and say by way of response. In the first place, of course, there are constraints to free will. You've given the physical ones that if you jump out of a building, you're almost certainly going to die when you fall to the ground. But we do need to understand that not everything reduces to physics. And chemistry is not just a matter of physics. In the organisation that one has in the molecular world, there are behaviours which are not totally determined by the underlying physics, and similarly in biology. Biology doesn't, I believe, simply reduce to physics and chemistry. And you can go on up a hierarchy of ever-increasing complexity, and where that remains the case. So then the question about free will and how that operates, and also how God, speaking as a Christian, how God interacts with me as a human being, has to do with, I think, the mind-brain problem, and in what way God would seek to influence the way we think and the choices we make, but at the same time leaving us with the responsibility of making those choices. We can't escape that.
Does that make sense to you, or?
Not entirely, but just going back to the question that kicked this off, what is the best argument against God? I don't think it's a matter of making an argument against God. It's pointing out that there isn't a great argument for God.
The burden of proof.
The burden of proof falls to the party making the positive claim. And so while individual models for God can be shown to be flawed, if someone actually stumps up and gives you what they define as their deity. Yeah. It's mostly the fact that there is no compelling evidence for a deity that I stopped believing and eventually called myself an atheist.
I suppose that makes sense.
How would you respond to the idea that religion tends to make people happier?
I don't know if there's data to show that, but I don't know that that's particularly important. I think alcohol makes people happy. I don't think you'd give it out free on a Sunday morning. Morphine made me happy when I broke my leg, but I don't think it should be made freely available. Happiness isn't the criterion. I care about what's true. And while I like being happy, I don't think I have any right to tell myself fairy stories to try and improve that situation. I think there are other ways of seeking happiness that don't require religion.
Can I butt in there? There has been some research done on not just on happiness so much as on health and well-being, general well-being. Professor Alistair McGrath, the noted British theologian and formerly a scientist, reported on one program of research which showed that people who were committed to their religious life tended to have less depression and fewer health problems at a given age than those who didn't. But he wasn't claiming in reporting that if you're religious, or in my case Christian, you'll necessarily be spared major health issues. I've survived major surgery many years ago, which means I can live a perfectly normal life today. In a former generation, I'd be sitting around in a wheelchair at this point. But at the same time, the question of our attitudes to life and the things that it throws up, and the difficult things like bereavement or loss of a child and so on, these are things which, in principle, I believe Christians can cope with better than those who don't have religious faith. I'm not saying other people don't, in some sense, deal with those issues and get through them, but I would argue that as a Christian, I've got a broad perspective in terms of what it means to be human in relation to God, and I think particularly mediated through the person of Jesus Christ. I want to emphasize that we're not just talking about a set of propositions, because Christianity in particular is really centers around a person who we believe appeared a bit more than 2,000 years ago, and that he died on a Roman cross, treated as a criminal, but that he actually rose from the dead. And there's a whole scenario of the new heaven and the new earth that picks up on that point, and we may not have time to pursue that here today.
Probably not.
But I still see the central point as largely irrelevant. It wouldn't matter if religion made people deliriously happy all the time and made them able to deal with any aspect of their life more easily. It doesn't actually show that any particular religion is true or valid. And that's mostly my concern, is the intrusions that people try to justify making into my life because of their religious convictions. And I don't see personal happiness as doing that job.
Really? I would argue that happiness is the most important thing in one's life, and the happiness of the people around them. And that if something can do this, whether that's truth, whether that's not truth, it doesn't really matter.
Well, if it's making me unhappy, where does that leave us?
Well, let's say...
So, is your happiness more important than mine?
No, I'm not talking about hedonism or anything.
No, I'm not talking about hedonism either, but if the personal happiness of religious people is a valid concept, does it outweigh the happiness of people who aren't religious?
No, not at all. I'm just saying that if religion makes someone happy, and if that particular person didn't have that religion, that would make them unhappy, then surely it's better that they're part of that religion.
They're welcome to it. I don't care what other people believe. I want them to keep it off my lawn. So I don't see the argument that religion makes people happy as justifying the intrusions that religion makes into my life.
Ah, okay. So you're fine with religion just so long as it doesn't bother you?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
I'm not ecstatic about it. I don't like people pushing ideas that I see as untrue or unsupported, but I can't say that people shouldn't believe. I have no right to say that people should not believe what they choose to believe.
That makes sense, I suppose. We've had a few comments. Someone says the best argument against God is Illuminati. So
someone hysterical.
Neil's is saying that Dave, if you study... I don't know, I think he thinks one of you is called Dave. I can only assume he's talking about John. He says, Dave, if you study history of Christianity, then they are truly worshipping Satan and they don't even know that they are brainwashed. This is... I'm not going to ask you to respond to that.
No, I'm not going to respond to that.
It's an interesting comment. Anyway, we have a song now. What's it called, Alan?
This is Embers by Kim Churchill. He's a brilliant folk musician, much like David Champagne. Yes, I like everyone like this. We're back with John Pilbrow from the... I was about to say the Atheist Foundation of Australia.
That's the wrong one. He's a professor of physics at Monash Uni.
And Matthew from the Australian Atheist Foundation of Australia.
And we've just been talking about Richard Dawkins.
Yes, a fun break topic perhaps, but not something we'll cover on air.
Yes.
So we were going to discuss kind of the limitations of science. Do you have any comments on that, John?
I'd just like to read a very short quote from a Nobel laureate, the late Sir Peter Medawar, who in fact actually shared the Nobel Prize in Medicine with Australia's Macfarlane Burnet in 1960. And in his little book, Advice to a Young Scientist, he says this: "There is no quicker way for a scientist to bring discredit upon himself and on his profession than roundly to declare, particularly when no declaration of that kind is called for, that science knows or soon will know the answers to all questions worth asking, and that the questions that do not admit a scientific answer are in some way non-questions or pseudo-questions that only simpletons ask and only the gullible profess to be able to answer." I point out that Peter Medawar called himself a rationalist. He wasn't a friend of religion.
Right.
I think that's an important statement.
Yeah, okay, so science... Sorry, Alan.
Any comments on that, Matthew? Or?
Oh, no, I'm happy to... Sorry, I was off in a reverie.
But all I'll say is that I believe someone like Richard Dawkins, who wrote The God Delusion, would in fact object to there being any sense there are limitations to what science can throw up.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
But my response would be any limit to science, and this actually was spurred by an online debate I had with a person disputing the Kalam cosmological argument for God. He points out that the limits of science end here, and the Kalam cosmological argument requires something to kickstart the universe. Science can't say anything beyond the Planck time after the Big Bang, if the Big Bang actually occurred. My counter to that was, that's still no reason to insert a God into that space.
Oh, well, yeah, no. Quite naturally, but we're just talking about science here, aren't we?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So, if there is no creator...
Just to wrap up everything.
Yeah, we're coming to the end, unfortunately. But
very sad.
Yes. If there is no creator, what's the point of life?
Well, I can answer that question, but before I do, I'd like to know your reason for thinking that there needs to be a reason for life. Where does that conceit arise?
Oh, well, okay, there's no need for it, quite obviously. It's very possible there's no meaning to life. But it would seem to me that a life without any point to it, I mean, it would seem that surely shouldn't we just kill ourselves right now?
Oh, you're welcome to if you really feel that way, but I think the genetic inheritance you have through evolution tends not to let people do that, because they tend not to breed and the line doesn't carry on. I think there is very good genetic reason to carry on, but at a personal level, I've generated my own reasons for living. I've found the meaning that I need. And, sorry, just to give an example of the genetic imperatives, my cat doesn't face existential dilemmas getting out of bed in the morning. It doesn't need a meaning for its life. It does its thing. We are the descendants of the tool makers, Homo habilis. We make things, we think about making things, we think in terms of narratives and stories. I think that that's an evolutionary tail that we occasionally wag and look for reasons that don't actually exist.
Okay. My only concern is that, I mean, rather, let's perhaps not with the killing ourselves right now, but it surely, if Perhaps I should just ask you this: what are your reasons for continuing to live?
Curiosity.
Curiosity.
I am fascinated by people. I wake up in the morning curious as to what my children are going to do. I want to know everything there is to know, and while I'm limited in my time, I'm doing my best to fulfill that ambition. I'm just having a great time.
But you would agree that that's all ultimately pointless?
Probably in a universal sense, but that doesn't make me feel any less meaningful. And it's about me. You're asking me what my reason for living is. You know, I don't need to make that universal to actually find meaning for myself.
Okay, well, that kind of makes sense. Okay, and John, would you have any answer to that?
I would agree with a lot of what Matthew's just said there. I have the same sort of curiosity about people and the world around. I wouldn't have been a scientist, I think, without that. But at a deeper level, about 54 years ago, I was confronted as a rather indifferent churchgoer and Christian by a sense of a presence of Christ, which I can't explain, and it hasn't happened again since. But at that point, I changed from unbelief to belief, and I haven't wavered from that. And I found deep meaning in the Christian journey, in believing in God. And of course there are assumptions we're making, call them metaphysical assumptions if you like, assumptions we make about who God is and the nature of the world, how we discern that, how we read, for example, the Bible, how we pick out from that the things that are really critical. I should point out that when I was a graduate student at Oxford, I was in a lab with four other students. Our doctoral supervisor was an Irish Catholic, still a practicing Catholic in his 80s today, and two of the other four were practicing Christians, and students changed, new ones came each year, and in the final year, 4 of us out of the 5 students were practicing Christians. One was a Catholic, and the rest of us were Anglicans, as it happened. So I don't think any of those people saw that there was any particular conflict, and that they were somehow engaged in exploring God's world, and that for me has been a defining tenet of my own particular professional career.
That does sound very nice.
It's very interesting, but unfortunately we're all out of time again. So thank you guys so much for coming in, Matthew, John.
My pleasure.
My pleasure.